One of the things that I pointed out last week is that the basic marriage killer is a thing called contempt. And contempt is that attitude of mind that looks at another person and no longer sees value in what they say or what they do, or particularly what they contribute into relationship. And, many times people say, well, don't look at me that way. And you'll say, I'm not looking at you anyway. But you can communicate contempt not only by saying things that are contemptuous, but by just the gestures. When you roll your eyes, or you turn your head, or you turn your back and walk away. Those are all different kinds of body languages that we can really send out that says to the person, I'm really not interested in what you have to say, or I'm not really caring about what you feel or what you think. You're not really worth the effort for me to sit and talk with you. And as I said yesterday, when psychologists observe this kind of behavior between a husband and wife, it becomes very, very clear that when there's contempt, that marriage doesn't have much success or a chance of succeeding over the long term. And what happens is we've lost sense of the value that we find in the other person. Think about it this way, that when we marry somebody, why do we choose the people we choose? Well, we find that even though, physical appearance and attractiveness are factors, they're usually only where the journey begins. The relationship really begins to become meaningful when we see something in that other person that we admire and that we would desire to see in our life. I use my wife and I as an example because it's the one I know the best. But my wife and I are extremely different people. We see things very, very differently. Part of that is the fact that men and women both have very different ways of looking at things. And we also come from different family cultures and backgrounds and histories. There's a whole combination of things that are too complex to really simplify. But the simple fact is that my wife tends to also, by personality, a very detailed, a very linear person. I mean, everything in our house has a place, and every place has a thing. And so it took years for my wife to train me to use something and then put it back where it belonged. Because particularly when you're cooking in the kitchen, my mom, it was like the Swedish cook on the Muppets. Stuff was all over the place. And then when everything was done and everybody had eaten, she'd collect all the dishes and then she'd spend hours cleaning up all of the mess. My wife had a different approach. First of all, said, I don't want to spend my life washing dishes while the rest of the family goes on and has fun. I want to be part of that activity. But secondly, she said it's so much simpler that if you've done something, you've used it, and you don't need to use it again, just rinse it out, put it in the dishwasher, or put it back where it belongs, and you save yourself so much time. That was something that was very, very difficult for me to learn, but over time I learned it. Now, she does it instinctively. For me, I still have to make a conscious effort to remember to do those kinds of things. Develop it as a habit, not as an instinct. But on the other hand, I tend to be more on the creative side, more the abstract side, which oftentimes happens with men. We like to say, well, we're looking at the big picture, but yeah, that sounds grand, but remember, the devil is in the details. And that's what I've found, that a lot of times I have this really big picture of how something should look, but when it gets down to the details, I don't take care of the little important things, and the whole thing falls apart. So it's really important for us to understand that we need each other, and we were attracted to the things in our spouse that we didn't have in ourselves. And so we were naturally drawn to them. But it's interesting because at the same time, the very thing which is their strength and is lacking in us kind of reveals the glaring inadequacies. And let me tell you this, before we get married, we make assumptions about each other. We assume that the other person is a lot like us, when in fact we soon discover that they're really not like us at all. And this is why when we get into this, and I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit, when we get into Ephesians 5, beginning in verse 22, he begins saying, wives, submit yourselves to your husband as to the Lord. And then he says to the husbands, love your wife just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, in verse 25. Now the reason I want to focus on those two, because those things really summarize the grand responsibility that husbands and wives have. And interestingly, it recognizes that women and men are not the same. As much as we all know the nonsense of transgenderism and all the rest of that is just complete nonsense. It's poppycock. It's not real. It's not biological. It's not factual. It's not scientific. What we do understand that men and women are very, very different creatures, but we need to recognize that we need to be valued, and we need to be valued in different ways. And that's why he begins by saying that, wives, you have to understand that your husband needs for you to submit to him in the same way that you submit to the Lord. Now, submission to the Lord is not slavery. It's not oppression. It's not tyrannical or dictatorial. And oftentimes there have been men, even pastors, who have taught that men are to have this kind of dictatorial role in their relationship with their wife. That's not what the word submission means here. What it means is that God will ordain for the husband to be the spiritual leader of his home. And it's interesting because I know that some men say, well, I do all these things because my wife is a woman and I can't give her those tasks. My wife takes care of all the finances in our house, partly because at some point in my ministry I didn't have time, but also she's so much better at keeping track of all that stuff than I am. I end up having to, use an accountant now to do my taxes. For years I did them myself. But the whole point was that she would collate all that information and present to me in an orderly form so that I could know how to fill out the form and get the information to our friends at the IRS. But you see, this is where there's a shared capacity, because she understood that in terms of an overall financial plan, I had a better idea, understood some of those concepts better than she did. But when it came to the details, she was much better at those things than I am. And this, I think, is really God's grand plan, that as a wife recognizes, submits to the fact that the ultimate leadership of the family and the home has to come from the husband. And if there's any one complaint I've had over the years, it's the fact that men won't step up. In fact, I've had some women say, well, I hate this passage because it tells me I have to be subservient to my husband. The word in the original for submit and the word subservient are not the same. This is a very different thing. It's not a matter of just being subservient. In fact, I've never found a wife who had a husband who really took the responsibility to fulfill verse 25, to love his wife as Christ loved the church, who ever objected to his leadership. The reason that most women object to men's leadership is they find that the men have abdicated that relationship, that leadership, or else even before they got married, they came from a place where men had abused their authority over them, and it was very, very painful. Believe me, most women, if they really get down and get honest, will admit, I really wish I was married to a man who would provide for me and protect me and care for me. And that's part of the issue, that what Paul is really telling us here is that men desperately need to be respected. Women desperately need to be loved. And this is where the rub comes, because a lot of times women will say, well, I'll show you love and I'll show you affection, and I'll be affection, I think is the best word. I think that every man wants that kind of affection. And she says, I'll show it to you when you've earned the right to be shown that. Well, first of all, what Paul's saying is if you married him, he has the right. But more importantly, you have the responsibility to show him that love and affection. He desperately needs to feel respected. And every man, I think that no matter how confident a man may be in every arena of his life, if he has a wife who regularly criticizes and belittles him or finds fault with everything he does, well, he's going to really become unhappy, and he's going to begin to pull back and begin to deprive you of the thing you need the most, which is for him to love you the way Christ loved the church. It is what we call a reciprocal relationship. It's not each of you giving 50%, it's each of you giving 100%. That a husband needs to love his wife with all of his heart and all his mind, all his body, all his strength, all his soul, just as he's supposed to love God. And I've had to say this to men many times, because they'll go on saying, she does this and she does that, and I'll tell them, listen, I don't doubt that everything you're saying is true. But in spite of that, you need to love her, because Jesus loved us when we had no love. In fact, we may have actually mocked and despised him and been blasphemous towards his name, and really gave him no regard to his death on the cross. So Christ loved us, and that's the model that we've been given to love our wives. That's why when women say to me, well, it's so unfair that wives have to submit. Which do you think is harder? Submitting to your husband as unto the Lord, because of the Lord, not because of him? or to love you the way Christ loved us. He was crucified. And that's really the calling that men have. So these two things are the key elements, and I'll probably have to spend more time developing this. But to understand that, gentlemen, your job is to love your wife in spite of how she's behaving, in spite of whether or not you feel that she deserves it, no matter how deeply she may have hurt or offended you or said things that wounded you. You need to still love her and pray for her. And secondly, wives, you need to understand that your husband, more than anything else in the world, what he wants is to feel that you respect him. And I don't want to go too far into this, but you see, affection is a key part of respect. In fact, what one group found is that couples who spent 6 seconds kissing before they went off to work had a much higher likelihood of their relationship surviving long term than those who didn't kiss at all or who had just simply a short peck on the cheek and out the door. You see, in that 6 seconds, there's something happens. There's a certain vulnerability, and this is really the challenge. Vulnerability is key for really having an intimate relationship with another person. And so if you get in a place where your spouse doesn't want to kiss you, doesn't want to embrace you, that should tell you that something has happened between the two of you that has caused a schism, and vulnerability now no longer becomes safe. And so I really encourage you to prayerfully look at that. But let me just say it now and kind of bring this to an end, that the key here in every successful relationship is for a wife to show her husband respect. And as a consequence, men will love their wives. And ladies, you've been sold a bill of goods. You've been told it's all about your appearance, that you have to look like a 18-year-old fashion model in order for you to be attractive to your husband. The most attractive thing to a man is a woman who respects him and loves him. And gentlemen, you have to understand that your wife isn't looking for somebody who can buy her everything she wants and flood her with gifts and make her life as easy as silk. No, she's looking for somebody who she knows is committed to providing for her, protecting her and her offspring, and caring for them in the way that Christ cares for the church. So, as you obvious, I have tons and tons to say about this stuff. So I'll stop here. We'll pick it up tomorrow, and hopefully you're still with me. God bless you. Go in His grace.